two quotations, Intellectuals in Society, quote, "The intelligentsia often divide people into those who are for change and those who are for the status quo."
Yes.
Candidate Barack Obama, "We are the change we have been waiting for."
Yes.
Tom?
People who say things like this act as if they're saying something new. This is what was being said back in the 1790s, and ever since then, you know, that there's nothing older than the idea that this is new. And it's
Thomas Paine, "We have it in our power to make the world over again."
There you are.
Right.
But in point of fact, again, this is one of those totally unquestioned and unsubstantiated statements. John Dewey was saying, you know, that made the same thing some 60 years ago, that those of us who are for change have to fight against those who are for the status quo. Now, the people he was talking about, people like Adam Smith was not for the status quo.
Of course not.
As I mentioned in the book, why would Adam Smith spend a whole decade writing a 900-page book to say how contented he was with the way things were? I mean, when you spend a decade writing a 900-page book, something is bugging you. You know, I mean. Right. And anyone who ever bothered to read Adam Smith would see that he is pretty ticked off about a lot of things.
Once again, two quotations. You quote, at a number of points in Intellectuals in Society, you quote Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Here's one of them. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "The word right is one of the most deceptive of pitfalls and a constant solicitation to fallacy." That's quotation one. Here's quotation two. Barack Obama, quote, "Healthcare should be a right for every American," close quote.
Well, there's the fallacy. No, it's the word right. It's amazing. And in one sense, I simply cannot explain it. People say we have a right to affordable housing, decent health care. We have a right to all kinds of stuff. And the question is, where did this right come from?
By the way, it is literally the case that I heard on the radio the other day. One of the questions in healthcare is plastic surgery, whether it'll be taxed or. I literally heard someone say that women have a right to Botox treatments.
There you are.
Just thought I'd mention that for you, Tom.
Yes, well, but that's no more arbitrary than all the other things that are called rights. I mean, right now we're going to have this trial of these terrorists in a court of law, which is absolutely unprecedented and absolutely absurd. And the question is, where did that right come from? Well, it's not in the Constitution. It is certainly not in the Geneva Convention. It's just that by loose thinking, people say, well, prisoners of war get treated that way. Yes, they're not prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention said what prisoners of war were. People who adhere to the Geneva Convention get the protections of it. But during the Second World War, when some German soldiers at the Battle of the Bulge put on American uniforms, infiltrated the U.S. line, and they were captured, they were simply lined up against the wall and shot and killed right there. And it was not something secret. The Army filmed it. And I've seen the films on the History Channel.
Really?
It was no question. If you don't play by the rules, you don't get the protection of the rules. It's that simple.
Right. This leads us to segment 4, Intellectuals in War. From Intellectuals in Society, discussing the role intellectuals played between the two world wars. Quote, "One of the most remarkable developments of the 1920s was an international movement among intellectuals promoting the idea that nations could get together and publicly renounce war." What were they thinking?
I guess they weren't thinking, they were reacting. They were reacting to the horrors of the First World War, which most of those intellectuals had supported, by the way. And now they decide, no, that was so awful, we have to renounce war. There's no thought that, yes, you can renounce war. That does not stop your neighbor from building up the biggest army in the world and coming in and killing you. It's much like this. It's much like the thinking about gun control. You know, that you say, well, listen, I don't think people should have guns. Hey, I wish people didn't have guns. But the fact is that passing a law does not stop them from having guns. It just makes you defenseless. Right. One of the things I think I mentioned in there in passing is that in Britain, the burglary rate is far higher than in the United States. And moreover, British burglars do not case the place before they go in. Now, if you're in the United States and you're going to bust into someone's house in the middle of the night, you may be met by a hail of bullets. Right. In Britain, they have made burglary a safe occupation. It's like OSHA for burglars.
All right. Vietnam, Intellectuals in Society again. Among the many implications of the war in Vietnam was that it once again illuminated the role of the intelligentsia in influencing the policies of a society and the course of history. Close quote. We didn't lose the war. The intellectuals surrendered on our behalf.
Yes. In fact, the communists themselves in later years admitted that there was no way they could have defeated the United States on the battlefield, and in fact that the Tet Offensive, which was the turning point, that the communist guerrilla movement was virtually wiped out in the South. But the intellectuals saw that as a victory for the communists, and the war was unwinnable. And once a democratic country decides that a war is unwinnable, it becomes unwinnable.
Right. Now, Tom, Vietnam raises a point that just has to be addressed, and that is the special place of intellectuals in the Democratic Party. Isn't that a fair point, that the Democratic Party became, at least as regards the Vietnam War, became wholly influenced by intellectual opinion, correct?
Yes.
How come?
But it's also true that Nixon was, and it's not.
No, that's true. That's true.
See, because here's the thing: Machiavelli thought of intellectuals as influencing events by influencing the rulers and changing their minds. That isn't the role, as Vietnam clearly showed. Nixon didn't care a damn for the intellectuals.
Right.
But they created a climate of opinion in which, if he continued that war, he would pay too high a political price. So he threw South Vietnam to the wolves, signed a negotiated agreement, and they love negotiated agreements. It doesn't matter what it says. So long as you sign it and you win the Nobel Prize, who cares if a few million people get killed in the aftermath?
What's the transmission mechanism from intellectual opinion to the larger climate of opinion? This is where the media comes in.
Oh, there are many. Oh,
right.
Yeah, there are many transmission belts. I mean, the schools, all from the elementary school right up through the graduate schools, the media, now increasingly the churches. Right. Even churches that we think of as conservative are out there pushing the liberal agenda.
Intellectuals in the Cold War, again, intellectuals in society. You're talking about Edward Kennedy. Senator Edward Kennedy was a leading voice for the nuclear freeze, joined by many other prominent political figures and by many in the media. Close quote. Now, this nuclear freeze movement reaches its most potent moment just as Ronald Reagan is setting in place the policies that actually
end the Cold War.
End the Cold War.
Yes.
How come? Why do they?
But this goes way back to at least the 20s. The idea that an arms race is wrong, and not only wrong, but is dangerous, that will lead to war. And of course, the counter evidence, again, like so many things that intellectuals believe, it is not subjected to any kind of empirical test. Because between the two world wars, you had all these arms agreements and renunciations of war, and all of that just encouraged the Axis power to feel they could win this war because the West was too gullible to arm themselves or defend themselves.
Tom, we're talking about the Cold War. What do you make of it that Harry Truman, who puts in place the fundamental structures of containment that remain in place for over 4 decades, Harry Truman takes office, was vice president for less than a year before taking office, assumes the Soviet Union is our ally because that was what he, and within a year he discovers that in fact they have aggressive intentions. He changes and constructs American containment. In my judgment, he's a kind of heroic figure, I would argue, and I think you agree with that. And then so he begins our position in the Cold War. He stands up to the Soviets, and Ronald Reagan is the one who ends it. Now let me tell you about this. The educational background. Harry Truman finished high school.
Yes.
Ronald Reagan's college degree comes not from some ancient Eastern university, such as those where you studied, but from Little Eureka College set in the farming towns of central Illinois. Is that significant?
It may well be, because they didn't have to fight off all the nonsense that would have been taught at these very prestigious institutions.